basically entering into practice with the anticipation that I would simply work for a firm, just like most graduates do, was my journey into this and my first step into the profession. I traveled abroad and did some event activities. I worked on a halftime show for the Super Bowl. And then I really found my passion later than that in sustainability through the rehabilitation of existing buildings and adaptive reuse. That's when my passion really ignited in the realm of what we can do with what we have. And then I began to see also in new buildings that we could do better. And that was about the time, just to date myself, that's about the time all these rating systems were coming out and getting some traction. So I really had a passion for that and carried it forward into practice. And luckily in practice, I was able to teach while I practiced. And I was able to both work on multifamily adaptive reuse while teaching. The most amazing growth period of my life, I have to say. Because of that connection with academia, I want to ask you a question really fast. So on that Slido app, it should pop up for you. I want to know how the academic space is doing. How are universities doing? And basically, while I was teaching, of course, and while I was practicing drawing mostly in 2D. And I was also teaching, and we were teaching mostly in 2D. We were creating 2D drawings. We were creating documents that were good for construction documents, but we weren't learning much from the process. I was able to witness through academia and practice the change in the way that we produce buildings with intelligent modeling, building intelligence that's embedded in the things that we do, and a higher level of efficiency within that space. It's taken a while for that to change. And I'm wondering if your poll is starting to reflect that. Let's see. They have awareness, but you have to train them yourself. They're doing okay, but there's room for improvement, definitely. Nope, they're not equipped. Whew, thank goodness, that's what percentage. And our recent hires are amazing. And okay, so we need to get them there to the last one, don't we? So that's a call to the education space, right? And so after each of these questions, what we're going to show are just some of the work that each of us have done. And that'll just be up, but we're not speaking to the slides. It's basically to tell you that when we go through this journey, each of us, what we're going to tell you is where we've touched this area of sustainability and improving the built environment. Because I work both in practice and education, eventually I became the interim chair for Kennesaw State for about 2 years. And within that time, I was able to really think about this and how we can make systemic change in the academic setting. So what I did is I introduced building excellence as the criteria for our award systems within our integrative design studios and other studios, because students needed to know how they were going to be judged once they left the academic environment. And thankfully, many years ago, the COAT Top 10 requirements, as many of you know, were integrated into the design excellence criteria. Because, believe it or not, at one time, sustainability was over here at this unique hobby of a project, I guess. Design excellence was over here for the AIA. And now they're together, right? I don't think enough has been said about that and how important that is for our professional representation to acknowledge the fact that sustainability is part of design excellence and critical to it. And so at the school, what I wanted to say is just basically that this merging of both profession and academics is so important that sharing knowledge between and giving back to your home institution or your local institution is extremely important. And having that dialogue and finding space to share stories from practice to stories in academia. Because answering that first question that we just looked at, we're not going to move it unless we are integrated in that process. I've been fortunate enough to be between both. And here, what I'm hoping to get out of my job at cove.tool is to continue to educate in that space for those who don't know about architecture, to continue to help them have the conversations with architects and bridge that conversation between the technology that'll get us there and also bridging back to academia. That's my role, that's my sphere of influence, and Ramya, you're next.
So thank thank you for the introduction, and thank you to cove.tool, thank you to Sandeep, thank you to Colin, Ed, for facilitating this amazing discussion, for having all these wonderful panelists here, and the wonderful audience as well. I see some friendly faces. Shout out to Stanton, the Nelson folks, and a few other cove.tool people who I've been interacting with recently. They're all awesome, and so I'm so excited to be here. A little bit about my background. I pursued architecture, subsequently moved on to energy modeling, and that's sort of been my bread and butter, because very early on I had this hunger to know why and how and by how much, and so that data-driven process was something that propelled me towards energy modeling, and I've been doing that for the last couple of years, and last 5 years I sort of got into the whole mode of being thankful for everything that's come my way, and so I decided to give back to the community. So I am the director of a local grassroots nonprofit as well. So just wanted to give a shout out to all the volunteers for that organization. It's called Green Cell. And while they work on different projects like food rescue, composting, we are currently running a Solarize Forsyth County program, initiative, campaign. My responsibility is to get those students to be amazing. So I work in the K-12 space, where we create education, STEM education, and how that relates to climate action, and also talk about, how, mentorship and how they can basically be advocates for, climate, mitigating climate change, basically. To talk about Windward, we are the company that's my day job. My weekends and my night job is the nonprofit that I work for. So the day job, Windward Engineers and Consultants, is a certified minority-owned firm, Native American firm, and we work with corporate clients and real estate partners to increase their diversity, spend, and commitments, basically. Nice. And so Windward is owned by the Shakopee Midwauketon Sioux community, which is a federally recognized sovereign Native American community based out of Scott County in Minnesota. And they have a strong philanthropy presence. $350 million goes to various organizations and tribes across the country. About $500 million is is loaned out to different organizations as well. So the Native American community has a strong relationship with the environment or nature. They have a very personal relationship, so they call that Unchi Maka, which is grandmother earth. And they have this tradition of, going forward, 7 generations, or planning ahead for 7 generations. What that means is their commitment to sustainability is very strong, because, they basically want to preserve the environment for future generations. When I joined Windward, I kind of was trying to understand why are they so passionate about sustainability, and obviously through COP26 I understood that there was a lot more involvement of the indigenous community, and that was because they understood that they called for more real action about mitigating climate change. It is an honor and a pleasure for me to be part of, to be leading or growing the practice of energy and sustainability at Windward Engineers, and mainly because I think the leadership understands that climate change disproportionately impacts people of color, minority communities and indigenous communities, and so Windward has really embraced the fact that we need to focus on this aspect very, boldly, and very looking ahead, basically, for the future. So keeping in line with that, walking the talk, we became the first minority firm to sign the MEP 2040 commitment, the Carbon Leadership Forum's MEP 2040 commitment, which means that we are calling for engineers to take greater ownership and accountability on what the kind of buildings or kind of systems they design, and also to basically, the pledge is about, net zero, getting to operational carbon by 2030, and, embodied carbon and operational carbon, net zero, targeting net zero by 2040 for all the projects that we work on. So that is the sort of commitment. And we've worked on a lot of different types of projects, but I think the most exciting one of the reasons I got on board with Windward was because this was existing building, 19 buildings, about 2.2 million square feet. So it had a wide variety of buildings. It had a water treatment plant, a water reclamation plant, a water bottling plant, a commercial laundry facility, a strip mall, an office, a pharmacy, a cultural center. I mean, it was just like a whole buffet of an ice arena. It had all these different buildings, and what would it take for these buildings to achieve net zero by 2035? What is the budget? What capital improvement projects can we bank on? What are the energy efficiency measures to reduce the energy consumption by 50%? I just submitted the report on Tuesday, so it was a huge effort, and it was pretty phenomenal, and I think the interesting lesson learned for me was what is the cost of carbon, for each of those strategies and initiatives. So I don't know, there's a poll, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we got a question too.
yeah, so I think I'm not able to read it from here, but I guess people can read it.
Yeah. Basically, it's on the increase of collaboration between engineers and architects related to building performance and analysis.
Yeah, and speaking to this, I think 2020 sort of changed things a lot. Things became virtual. I think companies went from regional practices to national practices. And so they realized that they could leverage talent from across the country. And therefore, you had someone in Dallas working in a project in California, someone in California working on a project in New York. What that meant is everybody needed to understand the changing landscape of energy codes and how that impacted their particular project. A story that I can share is, I think there was a feasibility study done on a particular project in 2020 or so. What is the answer? Somewhat.
We need more. Yep.
Yeah, and I guess that is kind of where I'm getting at as well. So 2021, the project went on hold and then it came back. So when it was initially, the feasibility study was done, the energy code was IECC 2012. But when it came back alive, the energy code was IECC 2021. So that was a huge leap. So we had to figure out what was the impact on cost, what was, what strategies should we embrace, what about decarbonization. So we had to not just think about, okay, in some states we are thinking about how can we beat this, in some states we're thinking about how can we do better. Are we positioning the client, are we positioning the building such that it is able to meet the requirements of the changing landscape, like cities and states and counties are having their own climate action plans. And 2021 was like an inflection point, in my opinion, where suddenly innovation was being funded.
Right. And
all these aggressive climate action policies were becoming laws. Like, for example, the NY LL32 and the NYC LL32 and LY LL97, which calls for predicting energy modeling, energy usage, as well as giving restrictions on emissions to projects exceeding 25,000 square feet. So with all these things coming into play, it now becomes a play of risk, right? Who is going to manage that risk? So what does it take to not meet those requirements, and who is going to be penalized for that? So with all this process, I would say that energy codes, we might want to do the next poll and see what.
Oh no, that was it's fine.
It's fine?
Yep.
Okay, so it was just supposed to be an open discussion. Yeah. Okay, so so I'm sorry, I get super excited about all this. So I'm like, really trying to get every word out that I want to say. So I apologize if it comes across like, oh my gosh, she's driving herself breathless. But I'm not going to die, I promise you. I don't have COVID either. That was not a good joke. But anyway, so
that was a good one.
So I think it's a changing landscape. So I would say the energy codes are forcing that collaboration between architects. Mm-hmm. But I think they are not doing, it's almost forcing it, so there is no process as such. Mm-hmm. So DOE recently came up with this number. It said that 136 million, buildings consume about $400 billion to heat and cool every year. And that amounts to 35% of carbon emissions and 40% of total energy use and 75% of the total electricity used. So imagine, just think about that number for a second. That's the existing building pool.
Wow.
And if we don't get this collaboration right, if we don't get the process right, I think what is going to happen is that it's going to eat into our profits, because we're going to mess up, we're going to not get this streamlined, we're not going to be efficient. So I think so what I'm driving at is there is a need for that process as codes move towards net zero building. And so that's sort of my take. I just want to end this with a personal story. My dad, he's been in the construction industry for about 45 years. He's built factories for Larsen Tubro and John Deere. He's retired now, of course. And so each time when I decided to pursue architecture, and then the speaker said, nobody understands what you're doing. I said, forget it, Dad. You don't bother about it. So recently he told me that finally people are beginning to understand what you are doing, what you're really doing. And so that sort of dawned on me that for the last couple of years, sustainability has been trying to get a seat at the table. We finally have the seat at the table, but I'm wondering whether it needs to be just a seat or if it needs to be the table itself. The entire table.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, evening, everyone. Howard Wertheimer. I'm an architect. Went to a little place down the street called Georgia Tech. I was in private practice for a long time. I was a partner and principal at Lord X Sargent. And one of my partners and mentors, Terry Sargent, sustainability was just sort of in his DNA, and he was really my mentor to think holistically about integrated sustainable design long before LEED became fashionable. And in 2006, I joined Georgia Tech to be their Director of Capital Planning and Space Management, ultimately being the Institute Architect, where I worked for 13 years. And some people say that was sort of the golden years of Georgia Tech. I hope that it's not. It's the golden years to this point in time, but hopefully others will take that baton and carry it forward. When I joined Georgia Tech in 2006, it was one LEED certified building. When I left, there were 25 LEED certified buildings. The last 5 were LEED Platinum, and 2 were top 10 Committee on the Environment Award winners, and 1 living building, fully certified living building challenge. And in part, I had the support of the leadership at Georgia Tech. I was able, when I joined, I was able to convince then President Wayne Clough to sign the American College and University President's Climate Commitment. So basically what that did, it put a line in the sand that Georgia Tech would be committed to sustainable campus development. And at first, there was a little pushback about LEED, and we thought about creating our own system, but LEED sort of had enough traction to be a good framework for us to proceed. And the nice thing about being at Georgia Tech and being in Atlanta, Georgia, just about any design firm or construction firm can get to Atlanta direct. So I would go to conferences and speak, and I would go to the expo hall and introduce myself to firms that interested me and whose work I admired and say, come to Georgia Tech, come visit me. And if you look at the portfolio of projects, while all of the projects tend to have local firms, and that's really important, a lot of these firms partnered with national firms who are bringing their subject matter expertise to Atlanta. And now that creates a ripple effect. So now that subject matter expertise resides in Atlanta, Georgia, or within the state. So hopefully those consultants can have that ripple effect to do regenerative design for clients other than Georgia Tech. And I remember, when we did the living building, I set up this ideas competition, and we shortlisted 3 teams, and some of you may have been involved in that wonderful process. We had a very little stipend, probably way too little. I know it's too little. But I remember Phil Harrison, the head of Perkins and Will, we sort of had a panel discussion with all 3 finalists, and no one had seen the work of the others. And Phil said, I cannot unlearn what I learned. We had never done a living building, so we were on this journey to learn from these 3 firms who all had at least one member of their team who had done a living building at some scale. It really didn't matter the size. It's the same 20 imperatives, same 7 petals that you have to comply with. And hopefully all those firms have taken those lessons learned, and all the individuals who may not be with those firms anymore, they've gone to other organizations, we won't name names, but But that's a good thing. So it's this ripple effect. And that was one of the goals of the Candida Fund, is not to build a building, but to create a culture of and a passion about regenerative design that does things that are good for the environment. So I guess I'll sort of pause there. I guess one last thing I will say, when I was at Georgia Tech, I sort of had this holistic approach to campus planning. A lot of my colleagues said, okay, we have this project, and the site is this. It's 1 acre bounded by this street or this adjacent building. And I said, no, we have to look at the campus as its own ecosystem. So every project site at Georgia Tech was 400 acres because you have utility distribution systems, you have stormwater runoff, you have tree canopy, pedestrian pathways, vehicular circulation, transit systems, and it all has to connect. So you have to sort of look big and then sort of whittle down to your project site to see what that ripple effect will be. And other projects might come out of those conversations rather than just looking myopically. So you have this holistic integration of architecture, engineering, landscape, technology, ecology, sustainability, fiscal stewardship, and what I like to think is really important is public art, because public art on the campus gets people out of their buildings and enjoying the outdoors, and Atlanta's a great climate. I know I talked to Sandeep a while back. During the pandemic, at the time I was the COO at the Piedmont Park Conservancy, and Piedmont Park was packed with people. And Sandeep says, it's too crowded. I come walk around Georgia Tech. Piedmont Park's 200 acres, Georgia Tech's 400 acres. And there's no one there. The students are gone, the faculty are gone, so she had this big playground to herself, and it was really gratifying to hear that. So I'll pause there.
Thanks, Al. We had his question up there. It was about urban space, and almost unanimously we had everyone answer that yes, public space does play a role in educating the public. And I do think there's a lesson to be learned from our campuses that are done correctly for our cities and for our master plan developments that we do and that we're engaged in.
Yeah, and I'll just share Ed invited me to teach at Kennesaw last fall, and it was great. And we took all the students to the Candida building, and almost 100% of the students said, why can't we have this at Kennesaw State? And I said, you can. Go talk to your administration. Students have such a large voice in what happens on a university campus. So if you know anyone on a campus and they want to passionate about doing a living building, you have agency to make that happen.
That's right.
I'm Emily Schickner with Harrison Design. I think that the both of you teed this up very well, because I will not speak to all the amazing things that you guys are working on and the buildings that you're creating. I'm going to speak more to maybe what we as individuals in our community can do moving forward with this information, with what we know is happening around us. At my firm, I work on senior living, I do multifamily mixed use, and I do single family residential. So I do have the benefit of touching individuals in their lives and creating an impact to their day-to-day at-home living environment. Where my passion lies is in that mental health and architecture connectivity. And when we spoke initially about this panel discussion, layering in that, to me, the most sustainable building is a building that will last for hundreds of years. So I love the facts that you gave on the buildings that are created today, but there's also that fact to layer in about the demolition and the toll that takes in our environment when we tear down buildings. And so we can create this beautiful, platinum LEED, if you will, or whatever certification you want to give. But if that building is torn down in 5 years, it is not sustainable. It is going to create waste in our environment. And so, where I'm going to go with this is what we can do to be advocates of that change. In 2019, I had suffered a personal tragic loss and said, what can I do more as a woman in my field to be able to speak up more towards what we need and to be advocating for women and for more diversity and equity and inclusion in our industry. And AIA, American Institute of Architects, was a perfect avenue they were going the direction of wanting more creativity and more inclusiveness, but also the Atlanta board was really heavily focused in that direction. So that helped me feel more, and I'm saying me because I really can only speak for me in this, it helped me feel more well-rounded. So when I look at my life or my day-to-day, I love my career. I'm very passionate about architecture. I love my personal interest in the mental health layer and designing buildings for seniors that can live in an environment that we hope creates a longer life for them, healthier interaction in community and food that we eat, and looking at disadvantaged communities and trying to find ways they have better access to cleaner air, and the fertility struggles with women that aren't in those clean air environments. We need to be advocates for that. We are architects and engineers and people that touch the built environment, and so knowing that we touch those people's lives in not only our career, but also have the chance to do it in our volunteer and in our activism. So that's why I believe that volunteer is where you can do that kind of outreach if your profession doesn't fully fulfill that realm for you. And I'll let Laura maybe speak more on like exactly what we do with AIA.
Sure.
And I take her lead on so many things with this. So.
Yes, so I'm Laura Morton at SSW Stevens & Wilkinson, a senior associate there, specializing in adaptive reuse, so touching on that a lot here is great, as well as the urban environment, mixed use. And outside of that, I was a transplant to Atlanta from Oklahoma after I graduated college there at Oklahoma State, and it was hard to come to a city like Atlanta and not have a network of people and other architects and people my age and on the same career path and trying to navigate what that looked like. And so pretty quickly I was drawn to AIA for that resource and having people that I could associate with on all levels within the profession. It was just a really good way to sort of have a pulse check on what others at my stage were doing in their firms, compensation, responsibilities, licensure, focusing on just growing my career and that trajectory in leadership. And so that's when I first started just going to AIA events, and then I had an opportunity to take a vacancy when a board member was leaving to go to grad school in Australia, and so that was about 6 or 7 years ago now, and I stepped into a role on the Atlanta board and have since held a few positions on the Atlanta board, and now represent the young architects across the state on the national level in Emily's old position. But in general, it's more than just volunteerism. That's definitely part of it. But AIA and other organizations give you different avenues to connect and different types of volunteer opportunities and organizations to work with. And in the bigger picture, it ties back to that community involvement and engagement, and we've talked about the environmental aspect of a lot of this with buildings, but ESG as a whole, the environmental and social governance initiatives that are becoming very focused on, and I do private developer work mainly. So those goals are becoming more focused on by the type of clients I work with, and so that social aspect I think is this new realm that we are stepping into beyond the environment, and not that there's not enough to still do there and be sustainable, but that's had a focus for 10 or 15 years now. And so this social aspect is really the next step, and what do buildings do for the people? What do the developments do for the people in the surrounding neighborhoods and communities that they're in? And so that's, I think, sort of the next step to this whole. And
it makes them lasting. And
yeah,
we talked about
right,
that. So the
right.
sustainability
that's where that sustainability really goes
reuse.
to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's really important. I worked on a project, I think that's one of the photos maybe going through here, Pittsburgh Yards, that's down in southwest Atlanta. And it was a very community-led development where we had monthly meetings with people in the surrounding neighborhoods to come in and say what they wanted this building to be. And it became this sort of economic hub for an underserved part of Atlanta. And so I think thinking of developments like that and engaging with the users and the community is really how you're going to get that long-term sustainability that then can tie in the other aspects.
There's such an immediate need that we all need to be aware of and cognizant of, and when we speak with our clients and the people that might be funding the projects that we're working on, we need to be very clear and transparent about where we need to be going with climate action, having experts like you all and many of you here being able to speak towards that helps support that the funding that is needed for that extra layer and the extra step. Sometimes it's more cost effective to be more sustainable, and you can
put dollars to some of the sustainable measures. Right. You know, it costs more on paper, but the payoff in the end, the social part really is hard. What is that worth? What does that look like? So
make it serve that community you're designing for, and understand that client base, and then let's layer in all that wonderful, amazing new technology in those buildings and watch that carbon footprint. But understanding that end user.
Yeah, I would add just one thing, what was just said, you came to a city, didn't know anyone, and we shouldn't underestimate the importance of mental health. The AIA gave you a network, which you didn't previously have. You're designing buildings that create opportunities for social engagement that hopefully sustain mental health and people's well-being, which oftentimes is a forgotten component in design. When we did the Candida building, equity is one of the petals. That was never on my radar as an architect. We did ADA compliance, but that was it. Yeah,
and
equity.
Even ADA compliance there are all sorts of different disabilities and abilities on that spectrum that
who wrote
universal inclusion is
not
very universal.
Right.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Give them a round of applause.